While entire civilizations fell to ash and ice, one forgotten people watched empires crumble from their frozen kingdom. They possessed something more powerful than any Viking sword, the secret to outliving death itself. Deep in the Arctic wasteland where the sun vanishes for half the year, scientists have found bones. Ancient bones that tell an impossible story. For 12,000 years, through ice ages that buried continents and winters that lasted decades, the same people lived in the same place. They never left. They never died out. They simply endured. The Sami people, known to medieval writers as the mysterious Finnar, achieved what no other culture could. They survived every disaster the earth could throw at them. While the Roman Empire collapsed and Viking kingdoms rose and fell, the Sami passed down secrets that kept their children alive through the longest, darkest nights in human history. But what was their secret? How did they do what countless mighty civilizations could not? The answer lies buried beneath the frozen ground of northern Scandinavia, hidden in ancient tools made from reindeer bone, whispered in songs older than Christianity itself. Scientists digging through layers of Ice Age Earth have uncovered evidence of something extraordinary. These people didn't just survive the cold, they mastered it completely. Dr. Eric Lundberg, an archaeologist working near the Arctic Circle, made a discovery that changed everything we thought we knew about survival. In a frozen cave system, his team found perfectly preserved artifacts spanning 8,000 years. Clothing, tools, and weapons that showed no change, no evolution. The same designs, used successfully generation after generation. It was like opening a time capsule, Lundberg explains. Everything we found proved that these people had figured out the perfect way to live in the harshest place on Earth. And then they never needed to change it. The medieval monk Adam of Bremen wrote in 1075 about these northern people. They surpass all others in swiftness, living by hunting alone. They can travel across snow faster than horses can run on dry ground. What he witnessed was the result of thousands of years of perfection. A people who had become one with their frozen world. But the Sami weren't just hunters. There was something much more remarkable. Archaeological evidence shows they developed the world's first sustainable partnership with wild animals. 8,000 years ago, they formed an alliance with reindeer herds that was part farming, part friendship, and completely revolutionary. While Southern Europeans were still learning to plant crops, the Sami had figured out how to live alongside massive herds of reindeer. They followed the animals across hundreds of miles of tundra, protecting them from wolves, guiding them to the best feeding grounds, and in return, the reindeer provided everything needed for survival. Meat, milk, hide for clothing, bones for tools, and most importantly, warmth. The reindeer partnership wasn't just about food and shelter. It was about reading the land itself. Reindeer can sense weather changes days before they happen. They know where to find food buried under feet of snow. They can navigate in complete darkness across featureless ice. By following the herds, the Sami learned to predict blizzards, find water in frozen wasteland, and travel safely through polar night. Ancient Sami songs, called joiks, preserve this knowledge in beautiful melodies that are really survival instructions set to music. Each song contains detailed information about reading cloud patterns, finding shelter, navigating by stars. Parents taught these songs to their children, and children taught them to their children, creating an unbroken chain of survival wisdom stretching back to the last ice age. One joik, still sung today, translates roughly to follow the antler scratches in the starlight. When a wind speaks of coming storm, find the rocks that hold yesterday's warmth. To outsiders, it sounds like poetry. To the Sami, it's a precise weather prediction system that has never failed. The clothing discoveries tell their own amazing story. While Viking warriors wore wool and leather that would freeze solid in Arctic temperatures, Sami craftspeople created garments that could keep a person warm in weather that would kill most humans in minutes. They used every part of the reindeer, layering different types of fur and hide to create a perfect insulation system. Scientists testing recreated Sami winter clothing found that a person could survive comfortably in temperatures as low as 60 degrees below zero. That's cold enough to freeze human breath before it hits the ground. Cold enough to shatter metal tools. Cold enough to stop a human heart in minutes. But wrapped in traditional Sami clothing, following traditional Sami techniques, a person could live normally in conditions that would defeat a modern expedition with all its high-tech gear. Every stitch, every cut, every design choice in Sami clothing represented generations of testing against the ultimate enemy, Arctic winter. There was no room for fashion or decoration. Everything had to work perfectly or people died. What emerged from this process was the most advanced cold weather survival system ever created. But perhaps the most remarkable discovery was what archaeologists didn't find. In 12,000 years of continuous habitation, there's almost no evidence of starvation, freezing, or mass death from natural disasters. The Sami had created a way of life so perfectly adapted to their environment that they could survive anything nature threw at them. While empires to the south rose and fell with changing weather patterns, while crop failures toppled kingdoms and volcanic winters ended entire civilizations, the Sami simply continued. They had found the secret that every human society searches for: true sustainability, a way to live that could last forever. The collision between two worlds began with the sound of oars cutting through northern waters. Viking longships, carrying warriors who had conquered much of Europe, sailed into the Arctic homeland of the Sami. What they found there challenged everything they thought they knew about power. King Harald Fairhair's expansion north in the 9th century wasn't about conquest in the traditional sense. His warriors quickly realized that the Sami couldn't be defeated by normal means. These people could disappear into landscapes where Vikings would freeze to death in hours. They could travel faster across snow than horses could run on grass. They seemed to control the very forces of winter itself. The first encounters were both terrifying and fascinating for the southern kingdoms. Viking sagas tell of northerners who could predict exactly when storms would hit, who moved through blizzards as easily as others walked through sunshine, who seemed to communicate with wild animals. To warriors who believed in strength above all else, the Sami represented a different kind of power entirely. They possess arts unknown to other mortals, wrote the chronicler Saxo Grammaticus. What they accomplish through knowledge of the natural world surpasses what others achieve through force of arms. This wasn't medieval superstition. It was an accurate description of 12,000 years of accumulated survival expertise. The Vikings needed what the Sami had. Not just their goods, the finest furs in the world, walrus ivory, amber from the frozen shores, but their knowledge. How did they predict weather so accurately? How did they travel impossible distances through Arctic wasteland? How did they find food where nothing seemed to live? Trade relationships developed, but they were unlike anything else in the Viking world. Usually, Vikings took what they wanted through conquest. With the Sami, they had to negotiate because the Sami held all the advantages in their own territory. A Viking war party might be unstoppable in open battle, but if they got lost in a blizzard or trapped by ice, all their weapons meant nothing. Archaeological evidence from trading posts shows a fascinating cultural exchange. Viking artifacts appear in Sami settlements, but always alongside traditional Sami tools that continued to be used. The Sami adopted some southern technology, but they never abandoned the survival methods that had kept them alive for millennia. They took what was useful and ignored the rest. More interesting are the Sami artifacts found in Viking settlements far to the south. Reindeer hide clothing, bone tools, and especially carved pieces of reindeer antler covered in mysterious symbols. These weren't just trade goods, they were learning aids. Vikings were trying to understand Sami survival techniques and bring them home. Some Vikings went much further. Historical records mention northern guides who traveled with Viking expeditions, men who could read ice conditions, predict weather, and navigate by techniques unknown to southern sailors. These guides were almost certainly Sami, sharing their ancient knowledge with warriors who had never imagined such expertise existed. But cultural exchange flowed both ways, and not all of it was peaceful. The expansion of Christianity brought a new kind of conflict to the north. Norwegian bishops saw Sami spiritual practices as a direct threat to the new faith. The sacred drums used for weather prediction, the songs that contained navigation instructions, the ceremonies that celebrated the partnership with reindeer, all of it was branded as witchcraft. The drums were the first target. These weren't just musical instruments. They were libraries of survival knowledge. Each drum contained detailed maps of the surrounding territory, marked with symbols that showed where to find shelter, how to read weather signs, and when to move the herds to new grazing areas. Some drums contained astronomical calculations that allowed accurate navigation by stars through the 6-month polar night. Norwegian authorities began confiscating and burning the drums, claiming they were tools of devil worship. To the Sami, this was like burning their history books, their weather manuals, and their survival guides all at once. The knowledge contained in each drum had been accumulated and refined over generations. Once destroyed, it was gone forever. The persecution went deeper than just objects. Sami spiritual leaders, called Noidi, were hunted down and executed. These were the people who held the deepest knowledge, how to read the subtle signs that predicted harsh weather weeks in advance, how to communicate with reindeer herds, how to find resources in apparently barren landscape. But the Sami had survived for 12,000 years by adapting to threats. They began hiding their knowledge in plain sight. Weather prediction techniques were disguised as innocent folklore. Reindeer herding practices continued, but were explained as simple animal husbandry rather than the sophisticated partnership they really represented. Navigation techniques were taught to children as games and songs. Parents found ways to pass on survival knowledge without attracting attention from Christian authorities. A mother teaching her daughter how to sew would also teach her how to read cloud patterns. A father showing his son how to care for reindeer would include lessons on predicting ice conditions. The knowledge survived by becoming invisible. Some of the most important discoveries happened underground, literally. Archaeological evidence shows that Sami families began burying sacred objects and survival tools in hidden caches scattered across their territory. These weren't just hiding spots. They were survival insurance policies. If a family was forced to flee suddenly, they would know where to find the tools they needed to survive in the wilderness. The hidden caches reveal something remarkable about Sami thinking. They weren't just preserving objects, they were preserving options. Each buried toolkit contained everything needed to start over from nothing. Clothing, tools, fire-starting materials, even small amounts of preserved food. A family could lose everything they owned and still survive by reaching one of these hidden caches. Even under pressure from southern authorities, the Sami never lost their connection to the land and the reindeer. The partnership that had sustained them through ice ages couldn't be broken by human laws. Herds still needed to be moved according to ancient patterns. Weather still needed to be predicted for survival. The knowledge might be hidden, but it remained alive. The most remarkable thing about this period wasn't what the Sami lost. It was what they kept. Despite systematic attempts to destroy their culture, the core survival knowledge remained intact. Hidden, disguised, practiced in secret but never forgotten. The people who had outlived ice ages weren't going to be defeated by cultural persecution either. Death came from the sky in 1783, and this time it threatened to kill everyone on Earth. The Loki volcano in Iceland erupted with such fury that it changed the weather across the entire world. But while millions died from starvation and cold across Europe, one forgotten people watched the ash fall and quietly prepared to survive the impossible once again. The Loki eruption was unlike anything in recorded history. It threw so much ash and poison gas into the atmosphere that the sun disappeared for months. Temperatures dropped so far that crops failed from Ireland to China. In France, the failed harvest helped trigger the revolution that would topple kings. In England, the death toll from starvation and disease reached into the hundreds of thousands. But in the far north, where the Sami had been perfecting survival techniques for 12,000 years, families gathered around their hearths and began telling the old stories. Stories about the time when fire mountains far away had made the world dark and cold before. Stories about how their ancestors had lived through years when nothing would grow and the reindeer herds had to eat bark to survive. These weren't just stories. They were detailed survival instructions passed down through countless generations about how to live through volcanic winters that could last for years. The Sami had seen this before. They had survived it before, and they were ready to survive it again. While European governments struggled to feed their people with failed crops, Sami families began implementing survival strategies that were older than written history. They knew exactly which plants and lichens could still be found even in volcanic winter. They knew how to preserve meat so it would last through years of darkness. Most importantly, they knew how to keep reindeer herds alive when normal food sources disappeared. The reindeer partnership that had sustained the Sami for millennia became their salvation once again. While horses and cattle across Europe died from eating ash-covered grass, reindeer survived because the Sami knew how to find food sources that other people didn't even know existed. Tree bark properly prepared could keep both humans and animals alive. Lichens growing on rocks contained nutrients that could sustain life through the darkest times. But survival wasn't just about food. The volcanic winter of 1783 brought temperatures so cold that rivers froze solid and snow fell in summer. Across Europe, people burned furniture and books to stay warm because normal fuel sources weren't enough. But the Sami had long ago perfected heating techniques that could keep families warm using materials that would seem worthless to outsiders. Archaeological evidence from this period shows something remarkable. While European settlements from this time period show signs of desperation, mass graves, evidence of people eating anything they could find, houses torn apart for fuel, Sami settlements show no such signs of crisis. Life continued normally, because what seemed like a world-ending disaster to others was just another winter to people who had been preparing for exactly this situation for 12,000 years. Dr. Astrid Nielsen, studying climate record from the 18th century, made a startling discovery. Temperature readings from the few weather stations that existed in northern Scandinavia show that the Sami somehow maintained normal winter routines even during the volcanic winter when most of Europe was in crisis. It's as if they had a completely different relationship with extreme cold, she explains. What killed thousands of people in more temperate climates didn't even disrupt their normal activities. The secret lay in knowledge that was invisible to outsiders. The Sami didn't just have better clothing or sturdier houses. They had something much more valuable, a complete understanding of how to read and respond to extreme weather conditions. They could predict exactly how long a volcanic winter would last, where to find food sources that others missed, and how to keep communities together when everything seemed hopeless. Even more remarkable was what happened after the crisis passed. While much of Europe took decades to recover from the volcanic winter, Sami communities emerged stronger than before. They had used the crisis as a teaching opportunity, ensuring that every person in their communities learned the traditional survival skills that might be needed for the next disaster. But the 18th century brought more than natural disasters to the north. The age of exploration had begun, and suddenly the Arctic wasn't just a frozen wasteland. It was a frontier filled with valuable resources that European powers wanted to claim. The knowledge that had kept the Sami alive through ice ages and volcanic winters now made them valuable allies for expeditions trying to map and exploit the Arctic. Explorer after explorer ventured into the north only to discover that survival in the Arctic was impossible without Sami guides. The techniques developed over millennia, how to navigate by subtle landmarks invisible to outsiders, how to predict ice conditions weeks in advance, how to find fresh water in a landscape of snow and ice, became the difference between successful expeditions and frozen corpses. Captain James Cook's voyage toward the North Pole relied heavily on Sami advisors who could read ice conditions with supernatural accuracy. Russian expeditions mapping Siberia hired Sami guides who could predict weather changes days before they happened. Even the mighty British Navy, masters of the world's oceans, found themselves helpless in Arctic waters without the traditional knowledge that Sami families had been refining for thousands of years. The irony was impossible to ignore. The same European powers that had spent centuries trying to destroy Sami culture now desperately needed that culture to achieve their goals in the Arctic. The knowledge that had been branded as primitive superstition was suddenly recognized as the most advanced survival science on Earth. But this recognition came with a price. Sami guides who shared their knowledge with European expeditions often found themselves caught between two worlds. Their own communities sometimes viewed them as traitors for helping outsiders. The Europeans saw them as useful tools, but never as equals. The knowledge that had kept their people alive for 12,000 years became a commodity to be bought and sold. Some Sami leaders found ways to turn this situation to their advantage. They began charging high fees for their services as guides and advisors. They insisted on contracts that protected their people's rights. Most cleverly, they shared enough knowledge to be useful, but held back the deepest secrets that would take a lifetime to truly understand. This period marked the beginning of a new kind of survival challenge for the Sami. They had outlived ice ages, volcanic winters, and cultural persecution. Now, they had to figure out how to survive, becoming valuable to the very people who had tried to destroy them. Once again, their ancient wisdom provided the answer. Adapt without losing what matters most. The world exploded into war in 1939, and suddenly the frozen homeland of the Sami became one of the most important battlefields on Earth. But while armies fought with tanks and planes, the real war in the Arctic would be won by people who understood something that no military academy taught: how to stay alive when everything around you is trying to kill you. World War II brought a new kind of invasion to the north. German forces, trying to control supply routes to Russia, found themselves fighting in conditions that their training had never prepared them for. Temperatures that could freeze weapons solid, snow so deep it could swallow tanks whole, and polar nights that lasted for months created a battlefield where traditional military tactics meant nothing. The Sami found themselves in an impossible position. Multiple armies were fighting across their ancestral lands, demanding food, shelter, and guides. Some Sami were forced to help the Germans. Others joined resistance movements supporting the Allies. But most tried to do what their ancestors had always done: survive by staying out of conflicts they didn't start. What nobody expected was how completely unprepared the modern armies were for Arctic warfare. German soldiers, equipped with the finest military technology in the world, began dying from exposure within days of arriving in Lapland. Their vehicles wouldn't start in the cold. Their weapons jammed. Their food froze solid. Everything that made them effective fighters in other climates became useless in the Arctic. Soviet forces fared little better. Despite coming from a cold country, most Russian soldiers had never experienced the extreme conditions of the far north. They struggled with the same problems that had defeated countless expeditions over the centuries: how to stay warm, how to find food, how to navigate across landscapes where everything looked exactly the same. But scattered among the military forces were Sami guides and scouts who moved through the Arctic like ghosts. While soldiers from both sides struggled to travel a few miles in a day, Sami guides could cover impossible distances in hours. While military supply lines broke down in blizzards, Sami families continued their normal activities, moving reindeer herds and maintaining communities as if there wasn't a world war happening around them. The contrast was startling and humbling. Modern armies, with all their technology and training, were helpless in conditions where Sami children played normally. Military engineers couldn't figure out how to keep equipment working in extreme cold, while Sami craftspeople had been making tools that functioned perfectly in Arctic conditions for thousands of years. Some military commanders began to understand that they needed more than Sami guides. They needed to learn Sami techniques. Special training programs were quietly established where soldiers learned traditional methods of Arctic survival: how to read snow conditions to avoid hidden dangers, how to build shelters that could keep people warm without fuel, how to find food sources that weren't obvious to outsiders. The most successful military operations in the Arctic during World War II were those that essentially adopted Sami methods wholesale. Small units, moving fast and light, using traditional navigation techniques and survival skills, proved far more effective than large armies trying to fight a conventional war in impossible conditions. But the war brought tragedy to the north as well. The German withdrawal in 1944, known as the Lapland War, involved a scorched earth policy that destroyed everything in northern Finland and Norway. Towns were burned, bridges blown up, and entire regions left uninhabitable. The Sami, who had lived in these areas for 12,000 years, watched their homeland become a wasteland. Yet even this disaster revealed the incredible resilience that had kept the Sami alive through ice ages. While military forces and civilian populations fled south to escape the destruction, many Sami families simply disappeared into the wilderness. They used hidden supply caches, traditional shelter techniques, and knowledge of the land to survive in areas that officials declared completely uninhabitable. When rescue teams finally reached these areas months later, they found Sami communities not just alive, but functioning normally. They had rebuilt using traditional techniques, found food sources that the military had missed, and maintained their communities using methods that were older than recorded history. Once again, the people who had outlived every previous disaster had outlived another one. The aftermath of the war marked a turning point in how the world viewed the Sami. Military reports from every army that had fought in the Arctic contained the same message. Survival in extreme conditions required traditional knowledge that couldn't be learned from books or taught in schools. It had to be lived, practiced, and passed down through generations of actual experience. Governments that had spent centuries trying to eliminate Sami culture suddenly wanted to preserve it for national security reasons. The knowledge that had been branded as primitive and backwards was now recognized as strategically important. Universities began studying Sami survival techniques. Military forces incorporated traditional methods into their training. But this recognition came too late for much of the traditional knowledge. Generations of persecution had already broken many of the links between elders and young people. Some survival techniques had been lost forever when the last people who knew them died during the war years. The communities that had preserved 12,000 years of accumulated wisdom were scattered and struggling to maintain their connections to the past. The Sami who survived the war faced a choice that their ancestors had confronted many times before: how to preserve what mattered most while adapting to completely changed circumstances. The modern world suddenly wanted their knowledge, but would learning modern ways mean losing the traditional wisdom that had kept them alive for millennia? Some Sami leaders saw an opportunity. They began working with researchers and military experts to document traditional knowledge that had never been written down before. They established schools where young Sami could learn both traditional survival skills and modern education. They found ways to preserve their culture while also participating in the wider world. Others remained suspicious of outside attention. They had seen too many promises broken, too many attempts to use their knowledge without respecting their people. They continued practicing traditional ways in remote areas, passing knowledge down to their children, maintaining the unbroken chain that stretched back to the ice ages. The post-war world was changing in ways that would challenge the Sami once again. Technology was advancing rapidly. The Arctic was becoming strategically important in the Cold War. Climate change was beginning to alter the environment that Sami culture was built around. But the people who had survived every previous change in human history were preparing to face these new challenges with the same wisdom that had carried them through ice ages, volcanic winters, cultural persecution, and World War. The question now was whether traditional knowledge developed over 12,000 years could help humanity survive the changes that were coming next. In 1986, the world watched in horror as the Chernobyl nuclear reactor exploded, spewing deadly radiation across thousands of miles. But in the remote forests of northern Scandinavia, an ancient people faced this modern disaster with knowledge that nuclear scientists didn't possess: how to survive when the very land beneath your feet becomes poisonous. The radioactive cloud from Chernobyl drifted north, contaminating the pristine wilderness that had been the Sami homeland for 12,000 years. Suddenly, The reindeer that had sustained their culture for millennia were too dangerous to eat. The berries their children had gathered for generations glowed with invisible death. The land itself had become an enemy. Government officials arrived in Sami communities with radiation detectors and evacuation orders. They explained that the area would be uninhabitable for decades, perhaps centuries. Entire populations would need to be relocated. Traditional ways of life would have to end. But they hadn't counted on the stubborn wisdom of people who had survived every previous disaster by refusing to abandon their homeland. Elder Mari Sami, leader of a community near the Norwegian border, listened to the evacuation orders and then asked a question that surprised the officials. How do you know which parts of our land are safe and which are dangerous? The scientists pointed to their radiation detectors, their maps, their measurements. Mari nodded politely and then began explaining knowledge that no instrument could measure. For 12,000 years, the Sami had been reading the land like a book. They knew which areas collected heavy particles from the air and which areas shed them. They understood how wind patterns carried dangerous substances and where those substances would settle. They had techniques for testing whether food was safe that were based on subtle signs that modern equipment couldn't detect. Most remarkably, they had traditional knowledge about dealing with poison land. Ancient Sami stories told of times when death in the air had made parts of their territory dangerous. These weren't just myths. They were survival instructions for dealing with invisible contamination that had been passed down through countless generations. The stories described techniques for identifying safe water sources, for finding areas where food could still be gathered safely, and for protecting communities when the environment itself became toxic. Some of these techniques seemed impossible to modern scientists, but when tested, they proved to be remarkably accurate ways of detecting and avoiding contamination. Dr. Lars Eriksson, a radiation specialist sent to help with the evacuation, found himself learning more from Sami elders than his university training had taught him. They could identify contaminated areas before our most sensitive equipment detected anything, he recalls. They were using knowledge about how particles move through the environment that we're only beginning to understand. Rather than evacuate, many Sami communities chose to adapt. They used traditional knowledge to identify safe areas within the contaminated zone. They developed new techniques for processing food that reduced radiation exposure. They modified ancient practices for the modern disaster, proving once again that survival wisdom developed over millennia could handle challenges that no one had imagined before. The reindeer herds presented the biggest challenge. These animals have been partners with the Sami for 8,000 years, but now they carried dangerous levels of radiation in their meat. Traditional Sami knowledge offered a solution that surprised everyone. Selective herding based on the animal's behavior and feeding patterns. Sami herders had always paid attention to which reindeer fed in which areas, but now this knowledge became a matter of life and death. They could identify which animals had grazed in contaminated areas and which had stayed in safer zones, using behavioral cues that scientists had never noticed. The result was a way to maintain the herds while keeping radiation exposure to acceptable levels. But the Chernobyl disaster revealed something troubling about the modern world's relationship with traditional knowledge. While Sami communities were successfully adapting to the crisis, government officials continued trying to force evacuations. They couldn't accept that people without university degrees might understand environmental dangers better than trained scientists. The conflict escalated when radiation levels in some areas began dropping faster than computer models predicted. Sami communities that had stayed in supposedly uninhabitable areas were showing lower rates of radiation exposure than people who had been relocated to safer zones. Traditional knowledge was proving more accurate than modern science, but few officials were willing to admit it. International attention focused on the Sami response to Chernobyl revealed the broader crisis facing traditional cultures around the world. Climate change was altering Arctic environments faster than ever before. Industrial development was disrupting ecosystems that had remained stable for millennia. The modern world was creating problems that required traditional solutions, but those solutions were disappearing as fast as the problems were multiplying. Young Sami found themselves caught between two worlds once again. They could see that traditional knowledge offered better ways of dealing with modern environmental crises, but the modern world offered opportunities and technologies that traditional life couldn't provide. Many left for cities, taking ancient wisdom with them, but unable to practice it in urban environments. Those who stayed faced the challenge of preserving knowledge that was becoming more valuable every day. Climate scientists began consulting with Sami elders about changes they had observed in weather patterns. Environmental researchers studied traditional techniques for living sustainably in harsh conditions. Military forces incorporated Sami survival methods into training programs. But the most important recognition came from an unexpected source: the international scientific community studying the long-term effects of the Chernobyl disaster. Research published in the late 1990s confirmed that Sami communities had developed the most effective strategies for living in contaminated environments. Their traditional knowledge had not only helped them survive, it had pointed toward solutions that could help other communities facing similar challenges. The implications were staggering. If 12,000-year-old knowledge could solve problems created by nuclear technology, what other modern challenges might be solved by traditional wisdom? Climate change, pollution, resource depletion, environmental collapse. All of these crises might require solutions that indigenous communities have been developing for millennia. The Chernobyl experience marked a turning point in how the world viewed traditional knowledge. It was no longer seen as primitive or outdated, but as advanced environmental science that had been tested and refined over thousands of years. The people who had outlived ice ages had once again proven that their ancient wisdom was perfectly suited for surviving modern disasters. Today, as the world faces its greatest challenge since the ice ages, the descendants of the ancient survivors hold knowledge that could determine humanity's future. Climate change is transforming the planet faster than any natural disaster in human history. But in the Arctic, where the changes are most extreme, one people watches the crisis unfold with eyes that have seen it all before. The Arctic is warming twice as fast as the rest of the planet. Ice that has existed for millions of years is melting. Weather patterns that have been stable since the last ice age are changing completely. Scientists studying these changes have made a startling discovery. The traditional knowledge of the Sami contains the most detailed long-term climate data available anywhere on Earth. Joik songs that seemed like simple folklore actually contain precise meteorological observations spanning centuries. Traditional stories about seasonal changes include details about ice formation, animal migration patterns, and weather cycles that scientists are only now learning to measure with sophisticated instruments. The Sami had been conducting climate research for 12,000 years without anyone realizing it. Dr. Sarah Chun, a climate scientist working with the International Panel on Climate Change, discovered this by accident while studying historical weather patterns in northern Scandinavia. "We were looking for long-term data to validate our climate models," she explains, "and we found that Sami oral traditions contain more accurate information than our best scientific records." The Joiks describe weather events that happened centuries before the first thermometer was invented. They include details about the thickness of sea ice, the timing of spring thaws, and changes in animal behavior that correlate perfectly with climate data from ice cores and tree rings. Traditional knowledge that had been dismissed as primitive superstition turned out to be the most sophisticated climate monitoring system ever developed. But the Sami aren't just observing climate change. They're living through its most dramatic effects. The reindeer herds that have been their partners for 8,000 years are struggling to adapt to rapidly changing conditions. Traditional migration routes are disrupted by new weather patterns. Grazing areas that have supported herds for millennia are becoming uninhabitable. Yet once again, traditional knowledge is providing solutions that modern science is struggling to find. Sami herders are identifying new grazing areas and migration routes using techniques for reading environmental changes that have been refined over countless generations. They're adapting ancient practices to help reindeer herds survive in conditions that have never existed before. The implications extend far beyond reindeer herding. As climate change creates new challenges for agriculture, water management, and disaster preparedness around the world, researchers are discovering that traditional knowledge from indigenous communities offers practical solutions. The same techniques that kept the Sami alive through ice ages are proving valuable for helping modern communities adapt to climate change. Permafrost that has been frozen for thousands of years is melting, releasing greenhouse gases and destabilizing the ground that Arctic communities depend on. Sami builders, using traditional construction techniques, are creating structures that remain stable even as the ground shifts beneath them. Their methods, developed through millennia of building in unstable conditions, work better than modern engineering approaches. Traditional food preservation techniques that kept Sami families fed through volcanic winters are being studied by researchers trying to develop sustainable food systems for a warming world. Ancient methods of water management are providing solutions for communities facing drought and flooding. Survival techniques tested through 12,000 years of climate disasters are becoming blueprints for climate adaptation. But perhaps the most valuable knowledge the Sami possess isn't technical, it's psychological. They have cultural methods for maintaining hope and community solidarity during long periods of crisis. They know how to make decisions that balance immediate survival needs with long-term sustainability. They understand how to preserve what matters most while adapting to completely changed conditions. Modern society is struggling with the mental and social challenges of climate change. How do you maintain hope when facing problems that seem impossible to solve? How do you make sacrifices today for benefits that won't appear for generations? How do you preserve human culture while adapting to environmental changes that require completely different ways of life? The Sami have been answering these questions for 12,000 years. Their culture has survived ice ages, volcanic winters, plague, persecution, war, and nuclear contamination by developing psychological and social techniques that kept communities together through the darkest times. These techniques are proving just as valuable as their environmental knowledge. Young Sami today face the same choice their ancestors have confronted for millennia: how to preserve ancient wisdom while adapting to new challenges. But now the stakes are global. The knowledge that kept their communities alive through ice ages might be essential for keeping human civilization alive through climate change. Some are becoming bridges between traditional and modern knowledge. They work with international research teams, sharing Sami techniques with scientists studying climate adaptation. They translate ancient wisdom into forms that modern institutions can understand and implement. They prove that traditional knowledge isn't backward-looking nostalgia. It's forward-looking wisdom for surviving an uncertain future. Others focus on preserving the knowledge within their own communities. They teach young people the joiks that contain climate data. They maintain reindeer herds using traditional methods that prove more sustainable than modern alternatives. They keep alive the techniques that might be needed when modern systems fail. The most remarkable discovery is that traditional Sami knowledge offers something that modern science lacks: proven methods for surviving catastrophic change while maintaining human dignity and community. They have techniques for adapting to new conditions without losing cultural identity. They know how to make communities resilient enough to survive disasters that last for generations. As climate change accelerates and modern society struggles to respond, the people who outlived ice ages offer the world's oldest lesson in survival. The key to enduring catastrophic change isn't fighting against it or surrendering to it. It's learning to dance with it. For 12,000 years, the Sami have been perfecting that dance. Now the rest of humanity needs to learn the steps. In the far north, where climate change is most visible and most extreme, the descendants of the ancient survivors continue their conversation with forces that shape survival itself. They remain, as they have always been, humanity's longest memory of what it means to endure when everything changes. And in a world facing changes as dramatic as any ice age, that memory may be the most valuable knowledge on Earth.